All right, welcome to Navigating Complexity, How to Manage Polarities. It'll kind of, in some ways, go off of what Tim spoke about last week, just in how do we manage to live in a world where we often hear that it's polarized. We have two poles. It seems like we often live in an either-or world. You have to choose this or that. So we're going to start with, if you have your packets, you've all seen this classic drawing. I'll show our viewers at home. You know, would you see, when you first look at it, and you've all seen it before, do you see the old woman or the young woman first? Old woman first? Yeah, it's like, depending on how you look at it, you can see both a young woman and an old woman. At first glance, you see one or the other. Once someone points it out to you, the second image often comes to view. I've seen this so many times now I can switch back and forth pretty quickly. There are other images like that where you may just see one first and have to have somebody point it out to you, the other one. Once you see it, it's there. So does everybody see both? No. All right, so who sees the young woman? All right, who cannot see the old woman? All right, the old woman kind of see the young woman's chin as her nose and her ear as her eye. Do you see the old woman now?
Yeah, she is old.
Like, okay, the hair, yeah. It's kind of like the babushka with the little thing over her.
The paper is on for people watching the live stream.
Oh, awesome.
You tell them there's a link.
There's a link to the paper if you at home watching, you want to have the notes. I always like to write out everything I'm going to say because it's hard to process everything all at once. You can go back and read it 55 times if you want. So you've seen the old woman, you've seen the young woman. Notice our minds cannot see these two images simultaneously. You have to see one or the other. You can't hold both at the same time. We have to switch back and forth. Intellectually, we know both are there, but we aren't naturally equipped to truly take in both at once. We are designed to identify and isolate one pattern, even if many exist. So as people, we struggle to hold two opposites, two choices, two paths, two visions in tension with each other at the same time. Much of theology is this sort of dialectical tension, holding two true things that don't at first glance seem to be able to work together. But so much of theology has to do that. You know, how is God three, yet one? Yet not one, yet not three, yet three, and yet one. I know, it's confusing, right? We've done a whole class on that, and it's still hard to kind of hold your mind around it. The example I often use with like atonement theories, why Jesus died on the cross. If you just hold on to one, you will distort the gospel message. And some distort it more than others. But there are many, and you have to kind of hold them all and vacillate between them. The example I use is a map. I've used this a lot. You look at a Mercator projection map. You cut out Greenland, it's bigger than Africa. Is Greenland bigger than Africa? No. But in order to make a three-dimensional thing two-dimensional, you have to distort something. So if kids grow up only looking at a Mercator projection map, they're going to have a distorted idea of the world. Now, there are other kinds of maps out there that exist. Each one will distort something. They'll distort the poles, they'll distort the middle, the sides. If you don't have access to a globe, the only way to understand a three-dimensional world then is to take multiple of those maps and kind of hold them together. You can only look at one at a time really, but know the truth is somewhere merging all of them together. And it's hard for our minds to do that. But that's how we have to do with a lot of the situations, challenges, complexities of our world. This is part of what is happening when we have to deal with polarities. And whether you realize it or not, you encounter and live with polarities every single day. So what is a polarity? Who has heard the term polarity before? Excellent, great. So a polarity, sometimes called a paradox, is a situation in which opposing forces within a system pull at each other to keep things balanced. To illustrate the point, ask yourself a question. Which is more important to breathing? Inhaling or exhaling? The question is absurd because breathing is an oscillation between these two polar activities. With any polarity like inhaling and exhaling, each pole can't exist without the other. Polarities are everywhere because we live in a complex world. In business, centralization versus decentralization, or growth versus profit maximization, are common examples of polarities. If you're in the business world, you kind of struggle with these things a lot. In life, think work-life balance, liberal versus conservative. A natural tension exists between the two that will always be there. It's an attribute of the system. Think about a car. What's more important to a car, the gas pedal or the brake pedal? Again, it's absurd, right? You need the gas to go. You need the brakes to stop. It's great to go, but eventually you're going to want to stop. If you're only stopping, you're not going anywhere. I kind of think of that sometimes in the world of there are people who like to push things forward, who move, who change. You need those people to ever have any organization, business, church, nation move forward, right? But you also need people who are brake people. Say, whoa, slow down a second. You can't just go shooting off too far. You need brake people. You need gas people. Sometimes you end up pushing everyone who are the gas pushers away. Now you only have brake and you're stuck. And sometimes you push all the people who want to stop things away, and now you're just going. Before you know it, you crash into something. I see that happening in the Presbyterian Church right now. In PCUSA, we're pushing out the brake people. And there's no one just left to say, hold on, stop. Is this the right thing? The nation bounces that. Sometimes we go really far, and sometimes we hit the brakes, we don't go anywhere. You need both. That's a polarity. But we humans are uncomfortable with that tension of having to manage both. In fact, it makes us so uncomfortable that we see it as a problem. And what do we do with problems? We either solve them or we ignore them. So what's the difference between a problem and a polarity? A problem can have a right or best answer. A solution exists. A polarity, also described as a paradox, conundrum, contradiction, is a dilemma that is ongoing, unsolvable, and contains seemingly opposite ideas. We think of polarities in adversarial terms such as growth versus consolidation, short-term versus long-term. Like who has an IRA here? You know, at some point you have to set up, is it long-term growth or short-term growth? Is it aggressive stocks or cautious stocks? You have like a supposed choice. You have innovation versus efficiency, centralization versus decentralization, change versus stability, responsibility versus freedom. We often set these up as either or, adversarial. And while it's easy to see these alternatives as directly opposed and in conflict, in truth, polarities are complementary and interdependent, like inhaling and exhaling, like the gas and the brake. Polarities aren't just about business or church strategy. They show up in choices about leadership and culture too. What is the right choice? Empathy or toughness? Keeping control or empowering others? Staying on task or working on the relationship? To work with polarities, you need to be able to see both perspectives clearly and at the same time. The trick isn't to solve the polarity or make a choice and move on. Instead, you handle a polarity by first recognizing what it is, a polarity, and second, learning how to mentally and practically move through the ebbs and flows a polarity presents. So let's look at like a real world kind of business example. So for example, a new headquarters executive sees too much inconsistency in the field, so she starts a one great company initiative. You know, those kind of things like, we're one dairy, we're one Bank of America, whatever it is. Let's move forward. Initiative to centralize decision making. Consistency improves, but the company gradually loses connection with local markets. 3 years later, a new executive comes to headquarters from the field, and seeing this new problem, he embarks on a by the field or for the field initiative to empower local leadership in order to drive decisions. And inevitably, this new solution results in creative approaches that work in isolation but don't scale across the business. I bet you can guess what the next leader does. And so the pendulum swings from one pole to the other as each new leader tries to problem solve away what is just a natural tension in the system. Do you see how that works in life often? We see it in politics, we see it in entertainment, we see it in the church. You know, churches have this struggle all the time. Do we try to make everything kind of go from grassroots up? And just put everything on the people. And really good things happen, and new ideas and everything. But eventually, it gets so kind of no one really knows the order and the structure that it gets so kind of loose that the things start to fall apart. So then you kind of re-centralize everything. It's like one person or one group. But then it kind of stifles off the creative flow of ideas. And so you swing back the other way. You swing back the other way. We have a hard time finding the both and in many situations. And especially nowadays, we want to see so many things in adversarial terms. I think in the politics of today, there are Republicans who have great ideas on how to fix and make life better. There are Democrats who have great ideas how to fix and make life better. But if you're a Democrat and a Republican comes to you with a good idea, you have to be like, no, it's a bad idea because you have an R by your name. Or vice versa, because we see it as a contest, we can't admit that's a good idea from the other side. We don't get too many bipartisan resolutions, but a lot of times, the best solution is a combination of both. But that requires working together. And we need more of that. In the church, in the politics of the nation, in business, you need both ideas, just like you need the gas and the brake of a car. So when you first begin to understand polarities, it's kind of like when you buy a blue Honda. You never really noticed them much before, but now you're seeing blue Hondas everywhere you go because polarities are embedded in the landscape. We tend to think their symptoms are just traditional problems. As we begin to see how pervasive they are and that they bring tension and bad outcomes but cannot be solved as problems, it can leave us a little more than unsettled. So you start seeing them everywhere. You're like, wow, no one's addressing this as a polarity. They're all just addressing this as one problem or the other. Why can't they see that it can be both and? And it starts to drive you crazy. So Dr. Barry Johnson, in his book, Polarity Management, Identifying and Managing Unsolvable Problems, he argues that a great many, but not all, of the issues we define as problems to be solved are actually polarities to be managed. So let's go back to the breathing analogy and look back more closely how polarity works. So Johnson used the idea of a matrix with 4 boxes. The box in the left-hand column are one pole, right-hand column the second pole. The top are the positive things about that pole, the bottom are the negative aspects. So when it comes to breathing, let's call inhaling is pole 1, exhaling pole 2. The positive side of inhaling is that the body receives oxygen. That's good, right? We like oxygen. We need that in life. So we build up oxygen. It gives us the energy to move. However, if we stop there and just stay on the inhaling side, what happens? You get a buildup of carbon dioxide and you die. So, O2, no, don't move around. Stop. Go back to the menu. Whatever. No, I don't want to vote. All right, so positive oxygen, good thing. But if you only stay in pole 1, you get carbon dioxide, you die. That's bad, right? So then, when you're down here getting carbon dioxide, you guys, you know what? You need to switch. And we go to pole 2, which is exhaling. The good about exhaling is it pushes out the carbon dioxide, which is good. But if we stop there, what happens? We get no oxygen. No oxygen. Then what happens? You die. A lot of death happening here. So you have to be able to have a seamless move back and forth to each. The idea is that the same dynamic applies to many polarities in human relationships. For example, take a church governing board that is divided between people who want a rigidly scheduled and tightly controlled church to those who want a spontaneous, adaptive, free-flowing style ministry. So let's have pole 1 be kind of very planned, rigid church, and pole 2 be kind of free-flowing, let the ideas go church. So the positive side of a planned environment, pole A, is that everyone knows their responsibility. Lines of accountability are clear. People know what to expect and how to plan. Resources can be effectively and efficiently marshaled or given for a task. All that is good, right? Good thing. Plan. We know Kathy knows when to set the doors to have them locked and unlocked, which is a huge thing. We need to know. We're just making stuff up. We never know the doors, then guess who they complain to? Kathy, the doors are locked. Did you tell me we need to unlock the doors? No, you're supposed to read my mind, Kathy. No, you need that rigid orderedness to just function sometimes. So everybody knows what to do, what their roles are, what are expected. Rigid, order, good. Lots of good things happening in a planned, rigid structure. But then, you stay there too long, you go down into box B, and life together becomes stale. Activities are kind of done by rote. Creativity is stifled. Opportunities are missed because the focus is keeping the machine running. New people with new gifts and passions find no way to plug in because everyone has their set job. I ran into this in my first church, the women's group. Everybody had their set job in the kitchen, so when somebody new came, all the jobs were taken. And you couldn't create a new idea or a new job because that's not how we do it. And so no one new ever joined, and so that group just kind of stayed, but as people kind of died, everybody already felt they had been cast out of the group, they didn't want to join, and so it dwindles. These are the real effects. It was good that they had order and system, but it was bad and it kicked everyone else out. Sometimes churches can get so stale in leadership, you have the same person there for so long, everybody's doing the same thing, that you just kind of keep doing what you're doing. And eventually things just kind of get stale. Sometimes it's okay to end a program you're not doing anymore, or change it up. So if you stay in the very planned, rigid church, things become stale and rote and just gets kind of lifeless, and people often feel kind of excluded because they have no way to plug in. So then you say, you know what, this is a problem. We see this, so we're going to jump and change to a whole different management style of the church. This happens all the time. Church is like, oh, we have this problem. Let's completely shake up our entire system and go to teams instead of committees and have this upside down session. They switch everything completely and think, now we're going to solve our problem. And they do for a while. Because now you're a free-form thinking church. The possibility of new dreams and vision is embraced. There's new energy, new opportunities are identified and pursued. Creativity is unleashed. Everyone feels they have a role and a voice. People begin to find new ways to minister they'd never thought of before. Church is back to life. And all these great things are happening. Like, yes, this new crazy pastor came in, brought this entirely new system, and everything is working great. Until they stay there too long. And they drop down here, and eventually chaos ensues. Overlapping activities happen, while other concerns drop through the cracks. Creativity is stifled because there's no way to effectively engage the community. Opportunities are missed because there's insufficient structure to mobilize people to action. This pushes the group back eventually. Let's get rid of that pastor. Let's bring in somebody else and get rigid things. Let's go back to structure and order. And then you start the cycle again. I see this in working with churches all the time. They shift one way, and they're there for a while, and then things are bad. They completely shift and go the complete opposite way. And they do that for a while. Then they completely shift. And I work with them and say, you realize what you're doing, right? Like what? And when you show it to them, and you show them the pattern, you can sometimes see their recognition, like, oh, we are doing that. But sometimes when you're inside of it, you don't see it. And you some of the outside just say, hey, you just keep going from one to the other. There was a church who, it was funny, they would hire a very introverted pastor, and then get mad that they weren't extroverted enough. They'd fire that person. Then they get a really extroverted, like, okay, this person's too outgoing. They're not that contemplative person that can just sit with us and hold our hand. So let's go back to this kind of more thoughtful, contemplative introvert. They're not outgoing and zany enough. They're not engaged in the congregation. We need to get an extrovert. They're not just calm enough. And I said, listen, you're just going back and forth in these two poles, and neither of them are actually providing what you need. You have to think about this differently. And so we got together and we thought about how can we manage these two different expectations you need to do it effectively. What we ended up doing was saying, maybe you don't need one full-time person because you can only afford. Maybe you need two kind of part-time people. One who's that very much kind of introvert, contemplative, and one who's very much that kind of outgoing, and let them both work together to meet those needs. That worked for them. Or you have to find somebody that's very good at code switching back and forth, and that's a hard person to find. So, this oscillation is a natural and healthy part of community. Polarization blocks the ability of this natural flow from happening, though. We say, no, we have to only do one or the other. We're going to be the rigid church, or we're going to be the free-flowing church. The other side is bad. That's when polarization happens, and it blocks us from getting things really done. Our confirmation biases can lead us to see only the positive of the pole we favor and the negative of the pole we dislike. It's that practice I talked about in our curious conversations that some of you have attended. Don't compare your best with their worst. That's saying, I only see this and I only see this. I refuse to compare these two things and these two things. I'm comparing these two things to say my pole is better. And that's what we do all the time in churches when it comes to how are we going to spend money, right? We had this a few years ago when we bought the new organ. Some people said we should not be spending $750,000 on an organ. Think of how much mission we could do with that. Is it wrong to spend money on mission? No. Is spending money on mission a good thing? Yes. What they were often doing, some of them would say, look at all the things you can do with mission. And then let's look at the negative of an organ. That's just using on Sundays. That's making it seem like, music's the most important thing and not loving one another. And it's going to require more upkeep. So they were comparing this. And the organ people, some of them were just comparing the positives and the negatives of mission. What we actually had to say was, here's the reality. You want to have good worship. You want to have a good organ to bring in a good music director, that'll bring in a good choir, that'll help worship. Because a lot of people come to this church, join, because they like the music program. And I said often, if you look at our money, the biggest givers to mission are also the biggest givers to music. And they're the ones who have said they come to the music program. So if you got rid of the positive of the music, you might lose a lot of those members, and the mission giving would actually go down, and you'd hurt this. It's a symbiotic relationship. Some people want to see it as you either do this or you do that. But what's interesting is since we got the organ, we've increased the choir. We've actually increased mission giving. Because right after we bought the organ, we did $450,000 to build a new school in Pakistan. And since the organ, we have consistently given over $500,000 of mission giving a year total from the church. So it wasn't one or the other, was it? But at first, we're only thinking this or that. Here's the positive mission, negative organ. Here's the positive organ, negative mission. See, these kind of things are everyday occurrences in church and in the world around us. The fact is that most polarities, most of us tend to lean towards one pole or the other. This is kind of natural. We have our biases. We tend to be overly, if not exclusively, focused on the positive aspects of our preferences and the negative of the polar opposite. Throw together people leaning toward opposite poles, and what too often happens is power struggles to make one pole or the other prevail. Now you're getting to the level of conflict where it's a contest, where it's not just about solving the problem, it's about my side winning versus your side. That happens in church all the time too. You create sides of, well, are we going to have one service or two? And people get into it. Or are we going to have this kind of music or that kind of music? Are we going to paint the walls gray or brown? Or whatever it is, people at first are looking at it, but then they start being like, I'm team brown. I'm team gray. We're going to crush the grays. Because we just naturally go towards sides and teams. And we have that kind of victory mindset. Anybody here for the youth Sunday back in November when they talked about the trip to Coromila? And it had this activity, red, blue, green. And the object was to end with positive points. It never says to beat the other team. It's just you want to end with positive points. And there was a way, if you looked at it, for both teams to end with positive points. But both sides are being like, how do we get positive points and crush them so they have negative? Immediately, that's how their minds went. They thought it must be a contest. And that's how we think of polarities. It has to be one pole or the other. My pole needs to win. And we start only seeing the positive of our pole. So, this is what leads to a lot of level 3 conflicts that are experienced in church and in the world. Because now the congregation is divided into sides, and there are winners and there are losers. And if not managed, the conflict can escalate quickly. Because once you're on a losing side, you don't feel too good, right? Whether that's in politics or in church or anything else. So you want to be able to manage that and not let it get to the two sides idea. But that's where we often just go. We lean to our side, we only see the positives, and we can't see the positives of the other side. You ask almost anybody off the street, tell me some of the really good things about the political party you didn't vote for. They're not going to say much. I've tried. And they tell me, and it's like, well, they can't. Or it has to be one of those like fake good things that are actually a bad thing, you know? Or people say like, you know how like people say, what are your weaknesses? And you really try to make your weaknesses strengths. I hate that. If I ask somebody I'm hiring, tell me about your weaknesses, and they try to make them actually be strengths, done with them. Because I want somebody to actually be able to realize what are your weaknesses. If you don't know your own weaknesses, you don't have self-awareness, you're not going to be a good employee. I try to tell people that when they interview. Like, no, like, do not do unless my weaknesses, I try too hard. I'm a perfectionist. Stop. Just say what you're bad at. You know? Recognize it. We get that way. I try to ask people, they cannot see the good on the other side. If you can't do that, you're not ever going to be part of the solution. And we need people who are part of the solution. So, 3 key shifts in approach to polarity and paradoxical situations that I think will help all of us in church and community and world do better. First is surfacing tensions. How much time do I have? I got time. People with a paradox mindset know that tensions exist in the landscape and actively seek them out. A good way to surface these tensions is to surround yourself with people of varying, even opposing views. Because again, we get ourselves in echo chambers. More and more studies show that we are grouping by like ideas, like it's not even so much class, race, religion, it's like philosophical mindset now. And we're clumping and we're getting ourselves in echo chambers. That's one reason we're trying to have these curious conversations, getting people who are different to actually listen to each other and have conversations. To go and try to find somebody who is different and create a relationship. Have coffee, talk, sit on each other's couch. If you're only ever with people who think and act like you, you're never going to know the tensions out there exist because you've cordoned yourself off. You have to be able to see and recognize those tensions, and often you need another pair of eyes. That's why, nowadays cars have blind spot detectors, because we have blind spots, right? All of us have blind spots in our life, and it takes somebody else often to point them out to us. And you need those people in your life that can point out the blind spots. So you've got to be able to surface the tensions to be able to deal with them. Then you have to be able to embrace the tensions. It's that staying in the room with difference we talk about in our curious conversations, that part of those 3 practices. Polarities and paradoxes require leaders to tolerate the discomfort that goes along with the natural tension in the system, avoiding the pull to make a decision just to get closure. Even when decisions are made, new information may require new thinking. Both and thinkers often are very clear about the big picture and an overarching higher purpose, but they know that achieving this aim requires some consistently inconsistent decision-making, right? And we don't like inconsistent decision-making. We call those people flip-floppers. And people get in trouble for that. But I always been the idea, if you have new information, I want you to change your mind. Or, just because one vote was really good in 1980, or do we live in the same world as 1980? No. you may change your vote because 2024 has a different set of context. But we're almost scared to because we'll be seen as you flip-flopped on that issue. No. And sometimes to eventually get forward, you have to kind of go to this side and this side and this side to kind of get there, taking different steps. It's always about the bigger picture and the context. So you have to embrace the tension that, yeah, in order to get here, I may have to do this thing. Or, this didn't work in this situation, but it may work now. It's different. Think about the church. I met with a couple weeks ago who were visiting, and they kind of said, you know what, we love kind of visiting. We felt that the church is a really open and welcoming place. And we've been to other churches that, they seem that way, but then you dig down, it always seems like, well, it's welcome and opening if you're like this, but not if you're like this. We really got this sense that Derry was just really open and welcoming and loving of all people. Oh, that's great. I always want to hear that, right? I shared that with our Membership Connections Committee, able to share, because that's a good thing about just the culture of the church. People come in, they feel welcome. But then they shared, they came here several years ago, I think it was early 90s or something. And and it didn't feel that way at all. And we didn't come back. So if they let one experience from over 20 years ago make them never decide to try something again, they wouldn't have the new church experience, right? Sometimes what doesn't work for you in one time may work for you later because situations have changed. You don't say, well, that didn't work, never doing that again. Taste buds change over time. There are lots of things I did not eat as a kid that I like now. But if I try something once, actually, you have to try something about 20 times to begin to understand if you like it or not. But if we say, no, didn't work this one time, never again, think how many foods we probably wouldn't eat that we enjoy now. So you have to be able to embrace sometimes the tension. And then you have to process the tension. Managing tension is an ongoing balancing process. It requires scanning for information to see how opposing ideas are distinct and different, while at the same time looking to identify how they can be linked and synergistic. They separate and connect. We need to be able to define and manage polarity over time. So, I was at a church. Did y'all get sheets, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So I was at a church last Saturday, a church like an ethnic Indian church. So they kind of come in the tradition of St. Thomas the Apostle going to India, this one section, coming over here. So a lot of their church members are immigrants because there's not a lot of jobs in that one area of India, and a lot of them have great education, so they become nurses and doctors, but then there aren't jobs there, so they leave and go other places. Kind of like Ireland, more people leave than stay. So they're a whole kind of ethnic group, and they have this tough thing in their church because some people still speak the language of that region of India, and they want to hold on to that language, so they want to have worship in that language. But then some people, especially the younger generation, don't know that language at all. So right now the thing is, one Sunday it's all in English, one Sunday it's all in this other language. So if you don't know the other language, you're sitting in worship and you've got nothing. And if you don't know English, the other Sunday you're sitting in worship and you got nothing. So it creates this kind of well, I kind of want to go every other week, but I feel it's important, but now I feel so disconnected. There's good to both. There's good to keeping worship in that language that connects you to your tradition, to your homeland. You're passing that on. You don't just want to forget that. On the other hand, English is important because the younger generation may not even know that other language. By worshiping in English, you're going to help to know English better, which is going to help you better get on with life here. So it's a tension you have to manage. And how do you do that? Because it can't just be one or the other, because in the long run, that won't work. But there are positives and negatives about worship in each language. So it's a polarity to manage. And I gave you just a few examples of how to potentially do that. I don't have a day of this, but I couldn't solve all the problems. So a few examples of polarities in church I've experienced where there isn't just one right answer and what we did about it. So traditional versus contemporary music. That was one that was brought up at the Indian church too. People have strong feelings about both. There are good and bad about both. there are some great hymns. There's some really bad old hymns. The reality is we've had 2,000 years to sort out the good hymns from the bad. So we had more time to kind of compile into good hymnals. But even in our hymnals, there's some hymns that people are like, oh, never sing that, it's horrible. It has a tough tune. The old blue hymn was really bad. About 50% of those tunes you just couldn't sing. Then some people hate the new music because it feels like 7-Eleven. You sing the same 7 words 11 times. It doesn't mean anything. But then you have those same people like Taizé worship, which is all meant by singing a few words and a simple melody again and again to allow space for God to come in. Some people say the traditional music is better because it has more theology. Some people say the newer contemporary stuff has great newer theology that fits for today's context. Some may appeal to this group, may appeal to that. But I always tell people, do what you're good at. If you have a really bad band, it's contemporary music is going to sound bad. On the flip side, if you have a really bad choir, it can be painful to listen to. You're trying to sing some of this like Bach stuff with a choir that really can't do it. It's not a pleasant experience for anybody. So how do you manage both of them? At one church I was at, we had 2 worship services. They're basically the same, except the music was different. We had a giant sanctuary, and at both services we had about 120 people, so it kind of felt very small in each service. So eventually we talked about, could we combine the services and have more of a blended worship where we had elements of both in? So what we did was we tried it for a 6-week period during Lent. We said we're going to try it for this period, then we're going to go back to how it was. So people know we have a set trial time to see how it's like. We're going to have time for you to share your ideas about it, share what you liked and didn't like, but no matter what, we are going back to the way it was after this 6-week period. So people know it's not forever, they can try it. So we did that. We tried it. Then we went back. Then over the summer, we went back to it again because people said we kind of liked it. And so we tried it again. And then we had another meeting after the summer. Do we want to keep doing this? And we had conversations. I remember this one older guy who always went to the early service where it was more contemporary. He said, do you mind not having that contemporary music as much anymore? He said, I hate it. I'm like, well, why do you come to the early service? Well, it's important to the younger people, and the younger people are important to me. That's wisdom right there. And I think eventually both sides saw that, hey, this traditional music, these old hymns that people sang as kids, and they have this tied memory to, that's important. You can't get rid of that. Because that's really important to a lot of people in our church. On the flip side, some people said, you know what, this kind of newer style music is really connecting with this new younger generation. They're coming to church. They're the ones doing all the work, the volunteering. We need to have something that speaks to them too. Just like the way the hymns may have spoken to us and created these lifelong memories, is this music for them. I don't want them to take away my music. How could I suggest taking away theirs? We got to that point by letting each have conversation with each other. So we got out of our echo chamber. So it wasn't just the choir talking to each other, and it wasn't just the band talking to each other. It was having conversations with each other to realize the positives of each pole and the negatives of each pole. Sometimes the band didn't realize some of the negatives of the band. Sometimes the choir didn't realize some of the negatives of the choir. You had to put them together. Same thing with the larger congregation. Funny thing, at the end, we kind of found, for that particular congregation, the thing that really connected both groups was more like a bluegrass, folksy style worship that used these old hymns, like Just a Closer Walk with Thee and Leaning on the Everlasting Arms, but done in a slightly more modern way. For that particular congregation, both groups really loved that. And so you kind of found a both and. So you still have some choir anthems, you still have some contemporary music, you still have your hymns, but you also have some of this bluegrass type stuff. And it just kind of worked because we found ways to have the positives amplified in both and the negatives reduced in both. But it only came by extended time, talking together, listening to each other, trying things, taking a step back, trying something different. The first solution wasn't the final solution. It took years of perfecting that one service, tweaking things to get it right. So it had continued listening and trial and error and a willingness to say, we're going to try this, and it doesn't work, to step back and try something different. That's how one polarity in a church got managed an effective way that ended up being really good in making that one worship service get bigger and bigger and bigger, and eventually grow the church and grow the music ministry. Because we didn't just say one or the other. I think if we had stuck with two services with two distinct groups, both of those groups would have dwindled and dwindled, and both those services would have dwindled and dwindled. Because they would have stayed in these two poles and eventually ended up only negative on each of them. That makes sense? So what are some polarities in the world that you see, that you've kind of identified as, hey, this is a polarity to be managed, not a problem to be solved? Okay.
I was thinking, I'm not sure this pertains exactly to your question, but I was thinking if somebody's really a sports nut and they like these teams and those teams and this sport and that sport, is that like anti-polarity because it's always my team against the other team, and maybe it teaches you to not look toward polarity?
I mean, not everything is a polarity. So sometimes you can have a favorite team, and it's not necessarily going to be a negative. Now, if you get to the point of only my team matters, only my team exists, I hate everyone else in the world, that's not good. But you can have like a favorite kind of thing, and it doesn't necessarily distract from polarities. Some things are kind of either-or choices at times. Some problems are problems to be solved, just not all of them. I think that's where you have to be able to see, okay, some things may have to be either-or. A lot of things can be a both-and. I think we're too trained to see things as binaries, only two choices, but often there's not. And even when it comes to problems, not every problem is a polarity, but not every problem has just one right answer. Often there's multiple right answers that could exist. You have to choose what's the best right answer. So some of you may have attended, we did like a leadership seminar several years ago. I used this video by a guy named DeWitt Jones, who was a National Geographic photographer. He kind of talks about how change is opportunity, a change curve, right? So every change can be a conflict, but every change can be an opportunity. And opportunities, change, are what makes photography interesting. And he talks about, he takes one picture. He has like one assignment for the National Geographic. He's got to get, the right picture. But he's taking these pictures. Ooh, that's a good one. And that's a good one. And that's a good one. But if you just stop with one picture, you haven't necessarily found the best one. So he's trying different light, different angles and everything. He has one example of like taking a picture of his grandson in a hammock, falling asleep with like a juice box in his hand. He's got one kind of distant photo showing the whole body laying on the hammock. So that's a good photo. Then he's kind of got one kind of from above. That's a good photo. Then he's got one kind of from the same level, just kind of a close-up of the child's sleeping face, a little bit of like juice around him, and just the box, and it's a little bit of the hammock in the background. It's like, that's the right one. Often, there's more than one right answer. And if you stop at the first one, you often don't find the best one. And often we want to stop at the first one because we're lazy. Because if we have a problem, we want to solve it quickly. So like, here's a solution, done. But often, can you keep going past, here's a solution, what's another solution? And what's another solution? And what's another solution? And maybe even try out the different solutions to figure out which one's going to be best. But often we're impatient people, right? So we don't want to say, well, we have this problem. We're going to figure out 3 years to solve it. So we're going to look at several different right answers and pick the best one that's going to ultimately affect things for 50 years. But we're like, no, pick one now so it makes it easier for the next 3 years. And that's an us problem. It's not a leadership problem. We had that problem with the church sometimes. People want a quick solution, so we don't want to take a long time to figure it out. It's a national problem. Because we say, well, this might help in 50 years, but it's going to make things painful now. No one wants that. Fix it now. We'll let future us deal with that problem. Let the next generation deal with it. Because we just want the quick answer. But often you have to go through to find multiple right answers. And then figure out what's the best answer of those right answers. And that can be a hard process. And it takes continued looking at the problem. Hey.
I think sometimes people, if their positive pole point doesn't get taken, they think that all their choices have ended. Like there is, like in the political situation, I've seen this. I belong to a separate women's book group, and right after the election, there was one lady. She was physically ill, like physically ill. And I said, "Are you okay?" And she goes, "Well, you know what happened on Tuesday." And I'm like, "But why are you sick?" You know, is my point. And she said her points, and I said, "So what are you going to do about it?" She goes, "There's nothing we can do." And it was a state it's something that's being sent back to the states, and I'm like, "Oh no, there's a lot." And she was shocked that I like listed 20 different avenues to take. But there's so many people that when something is decided, they think that anything that is in their viewpoint is gone now.
Yeah.
And that to me is always so frustrating. It's like, okay, maybe that's off the table, but here's this.
There's more than one right answer.
Or I'm one of them naysayer people a lot of times. In fact, the job interview I went to, Debbie Hope was my reference, and they laughed because it said that I would be the person that point out when people were going too fast ahead. I would point out, well, did you think about this? Did you think
You can be that brake person,
Yeah.
which you need.
But that doesn't mean you're not going to get on board with the
Yeah.
people. It just means you're the brake person. I laughed because they pointed at their paper and she had put that down,
Yeah.
and I was like, "Oh, it is me. That's
You
who
need
I am."
brake people to say,
But-
well, think about these
But just because you're a brake person doesn't mean, or that you were the go-ahead person,
Mhm.
doesn't mean when somebody breaks you that you have to
Yeah.
stop. And I think that's
or as a
where,
personal affront. Like, I think, again, it goes into that idea of we make things contest, that, well, the positive, this poll got chosen, the positive of my poll, so now all of this is gone forever.
right,
No. You can still find ways to work with both,
right,
and it doesn't mean that then you have to hate everything about that, because you may really lift up the negatives of this. But can you at least, in the short term,
see some positives.
also see the positive? Well, trying to figure out how do we shift some of these things to this.
Right, and it's well, in education we have that. We
Yeah,
go this
but we
way,
make things a
and we
zero-
go way this way.
We make things a zero-sum game too often. That it's all this, all that, and we set it up where, well, if this side wins, everything good, and this side's gone forever, you know, and we can't do anything. That's not helpful. It doesn't mean you have to say, if your poll 1 and poll 2 wins, you don't have to say everything in poll 2 is valid and everything in the negative is not valid. You can still point out these things while still holding these things and still holding these things. But if you're going to do this and do this and do this, what else do you have to do?
The other one.
You have to do this too. And that's the problem.
We don't know. what
We don't want to do that. I was doing my conflict training last Saturday. I said one of the best things you can do is from the beginning, point out this in your own side. When we had the Palestinian woman here talking about the conflict in Palestine and Israel, and like her thing of what the solution should be, a one-state solution, I asked, what are some of the negatives of a one-state solution? She said there aren't any. She lost me. I'm like, I don't trust anything you say now. You've lost all legitimacy. Because you cannot name the negatives of a one-state solution. And there are plenty. There are also negatives of a two-state solution. I'm not saying one is better than the other right now, but if you can't acknowledge that there are some serious issues that exist with this plan, you're not actually going to be able to go forward, and I can't take you seriously as a person, as a presenter. So often when I'm trying to present something, I'll often share, here are the negatives of this. I realize the negatives of this. I think the positives outweigh the negatives, but I don't want you to think I'm naive to the negatives of what I'm presenting, because I know that they exist. When I want to give my opinion on something, I'll often just kind of share, these are the weaknesses of this. This is the problems of this. And I realize it. I just think the positives of this are better than the positives of that side. Here's why. But if you can't name this, you can't be in serious conversation with us. And I think that's what's happening around too much. People only want to talk these. Or these. They don't want to talk the negatives in their own sphere. The best way, I think, for people to move forward and manage polarities is to almost start the conversation with, yep, I recognize the negatives of the poll I kind of tend towards. Here's what they are. I see them. I know them. Let's have a conversation. But we don't do that very often. We don't even want to see them. And that becomes very problematic. I've said this, I started coming into some church groups because I said every time I try to point out, I'm with you on all this stuff, but whenever I try to point out this, y'all get really mad and like kind of shame or say I'm evil or whatever. Like, no, I'm not going to engage in this because like you can't have a conversation about some of the potential problems here. So what's the point of the voice there? I think it happens even in churches, in larger church groups. They're very passionate about this, but they can't deal with this. And it's on both sides of those things. Yes?
I tend to be kind of a more emotional person, and for me, this church feels more intellectual, but I can be this way too. So when I come here, I try to be in this, intellectual realm and try to leave my emotions out. So I'm trying to bring both together. Like when I ask for prayers, I'm trying to be more honest of what's going on. And the thing that helps me in feeling more here is because I feel like you straddle both. Like in your sermons, you're hitting my emotional part, but then I can feel as you talk, like the spirit moving for me. So, so within myself, I feel like I have to do both. It's hard for me to kind of bring both together. I've been working on that. And kind of like what this lady over here was talking about, I felt like you were talking about more of an intellectual part, but this lady was getting emotional about it. So for me, it's just trying to to build this bridge and to stay on the bridge and not be on each side. It takes a lot of effort. It really
We have
does.
inner polarities,
Yeah.
and we talk about you should bring your whole self, intellect and emotions, and often we try to tend to one or the other. I will freely admit, like positive, I'm an intellect person. My negatives, I'm not always great with emotions. Like one of the times my wife made fun of me because I said you hurt my feeling.
I'm feeling.
I'm not the most emotional, gushy person. This is not the way I can do that, but it's not my go-to. So I have to sometimes intentionally work. It's not that emotions are negative. It's not all the time it's positive, negative. It's a different side. I have to work on that part, but I know it's not my natural strength. You want to be able to bring both parts to church, and our church wants to have both. So often, like our Tuesday night worship is more going to go towards the feeling worship. You have more of that small communion, the tazay, the chant. That's why often when I hire people, the church hires people and I'm working with them, I try, like Marie and I were a good team because we had a lot of similarities, but we had some big strength differences. Like, I'll try to hire somebody, like another pastor who's not exactly like me. We don't need two Stevens. Lord knows we don't need more of that.
Amen.
Yes! You need somebody that can complement, that has different skill sets, right? Kind of the introvert, extrovert at one church. Actually, I'm more of an introvert. It stretches me to kind of be all, but I know it's important at times. But it wears me out. But you need both. And so you need people at church who can really kind of tap into that emotive side. And we have people who do that to help lead worship. The music side often does that. In every worship you have, sometimes the liturgy and the prayers, the music might tap more into the emotive. And sometimes a prayer or a sermon might tap more into the intellectual. And again, it's that both and trying to do that. We are intentional about that in worship, but also just about the kind of staff we hire, of who might help tap into that better in different people. So you don't have this two super intellectual or two super zany people or whatever it is to kind of connect. All right, we got 2 minutes.
Well, the thing too is to look at it, like when you said emotional, I can think intellectually, but down inside I am more a reactive emotional person, and I know that, so I have to control that. But I am often the person that's hiding their face in church because I cry over the most. I will tell you, sometimes people look at you and go, why are you crying? And
There's a
I'm
couple
like,
people who I know will cry at anything. Sometimes the almost secret thing, like, ooh, can I get this person to cry today? And I know the right words to do it. And they know I know that about them. I'm like, and I was like, you're gonna cry today. Because I know something's gonna, it's kind of, it's a joke thing. But another interesting thing, people who say they're more intellectual, rational, and they make decisions like this and not like this.
they're making it here.
Yeah, there's a book, Tim, you've read it, right? The Righteous Mind? No. Bill Tresher, so, I was talking about somebody else. So Jonathan Hayden's book, The Righteous Mind, talks about how we often think we're these logical, rational thinkers. But that's not how we work. We make a gut decision, and then we go find the rational facts to back up that decision. We think we're operating one way, but we're not. And you have to kind of realize that. I did a class several years ago, a little bit about that, using his book, about kind of how our minds work with heuristic and biases and all these different things, but we don't actually think the way we think. And you have to recognize that. Like, we're all working more out of our emotions and our guts than we realize. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It makes a lot of sense. You have to do it. It takes a lot of energy to think rationally. When you're driving a car, you're not thinking rationally. You're in autopilot mode. That's why you can have a conversation with your person next to you about politics or whatever, because the driving part is just pure emotive instinct. But if you suddenly see those red brake lights come on ahead of you, you're switching. And then your next mind takes over. He uses the example of like somebody riding on an elephant, steering. And most of the time the elephant's going to take control and go. So it takes a whole lot of effort to steer an elephant, but sometimes you have to. That's why most political ads actually appeal to the emotions, the fear, the greed, because it's quicker. You can do that in a 30-second ad, and it's more effective. To really get somebody to engage their rational mind, that takes a long time, and it's hard work. You're not going to do that in a 30-second political ad. So most is always going to the emotive side, because it's often more effective. All right, I got to go up and get ready for church. Thank you all very much. If you have questions, want any more, we can do more classes like this kind of stuff. Have a good one.
Thank you.